Help understand like difference between mass timber, concrete, and modular.
Overall, capitalizing and getting the finance stack for a mass timber building may be more difficult than, say, a concrete building. So when the developer is going through that triage of kind of figuring out what they want to build, if they're going to build mass timber, usually they have a strong commitment, whether it's organizationally or personally, to sustainability. The reality is if we're looking at high density, affordable housing, concrete tends to make the most sense from a development standpoint today. The reason being is that we see the speed of construction with concrete. We can do anywhere from 3 to 5 day pour cycles. So your floors are going up much faster than, say, a conventional wood frame building or other types of approaches. So you're able to maximize that floor ceiling space. You're getting the most amount of units with proper head height in the smallest amount of building possible, which allows you to save money on your exterior skin and other systems throughout the process. So being smart about your structure has cascading impacts to how you build the rest of it. Now, the other side of that is thinking about long-term insurance. We've seen a lot of our clients that would traditionally build a conventional stick frame product looking more at concrete because of this insurance savings on permanent property insurance over the course of, say, 10 years. We did some modeling for a client on a 7-story building, which was originally podium with sort of stick framing above. And we looked at that compared to a concrete approach. Concrete saved them time because the construction schedule was faster due to concrete structure. But also our builder's risk policy that we carried during that project was roughly a third of the cost for non-combustible construction versus something like wood framing. And then you pass that along to permanent property insurance. A concrete building, if the same hypothetical building, saved the client close to $5 million over the course of 10 years of owning that building. So again, you might have a development lead that's thinking about the construction cost, but a lot of times the development part of that company doesn't always talk to the asset management part of that company. And having conversations between those silos is really important because that may not be a pain point for someone, but it also may be a deal killer for someone. So again, we don't come in with the approach saying, hey, you must do this as this is why we think it makes sense. We're saying these are the pros and cons of these different approaches. We can build them all for you. It's your choice. As a general contractor, we've completed over 65 mass timber buildings, which I believe is more than any other GC in the United States. And so we're really committed to that technology for a few reasons. We like that there's heavily influenced by prefabrication. The idea that we can take raw lumber, whether that's a piece of glue lam or whether that's a piece of CLT, bring it to our fabrication facility, set it up with the hardware, ship it out to our job sites, and it goes up very quickly. It's great for urban infill sites. It's very quiet as it goes up. And so from the construction logistics standpoint, we really see that benefit. But then let's talk about what the product at the end of the day looks like.
Okay, welcome to another episode of Affordable Housing and Real Estate Investing. Guys, I've been looking forward to this interview for like weeks. I have Patrick Otellini from Swinerton on the podcast today. Now, this guy has worked in the city. This guy is a musician. He's in construction. I mean, talk about doing a little bit of everything and bringing the best out to help us build more affordable housing. So I could not be more excited to bring on Patrick onto the podcast. Patrick, how you doing today, man?
No, great to be with you, Ken. Thanks for having me today.
Man, I am just so jazzed about this. When I was talking on the Zoom with you, getting ready for this podcast, I was like, man, finally, the ideas that I have don't sound crazy. And I just got to start from the beginning a little bit because, Patrick, I want people to understand and get a little bit motivated and inspired by your career path because you didn't take the most linear path into construction. So tell people a little bit about your background and how did you even get into the world of affordable housing in the first place?
Sure. So I spent the first part of my career working in San Francisco for a small MBE consulting firm doing building and fire code consulting. So what that really means is we were helping people navigate the entitlement and the permit process in one of the most complicated cities to do that in the world. Through that, it was a great experience because I got to not only learn the background of both the building and the fire code, but also to work with all of the best developers, all of the best architects, all of the best builders in the region that I grew up in. So it was really exciting to kind of understand the industry starting at 20 years old at that level. It was an amazing experience. And starting out doing that work was really fantastic. And it allowed me some interesting opportunities. Now, when Gavin Newsom was mayor of San Francisco, he started looking at a program to better understand how we could retrofit the dangerous soft story buildings in San Francisco. And so through that was kind of my first foray into public service. I joined a task force, obviously still keeping my job, but doing this as a volunteer opportunity was a really eye-opening experience to how policy gets made in that space. And from there, I was offered a position when Gavin became lieutenant governor and Ed Lee was the city administrator who became mayor, was really passionate about developing and implementing a 30-year earthquake safety plan for the city. And so at that time, I joined the administration as the city's first director of earthquake safety and continued in that role to amend the San Francisco Building Code, launch policies. The thing that we were the most proud of was the soft story retrofit ordinance, which protected the homes of 120,000 San Franciscans that lived in seismically dangerous buildings. So to look at the affordability crisis through that lens was pretty eye-opening for me personally. These are rent-controlled properties. These are long-term tenants, but they had very little ability to have any kind of decision-making process around how we make their homes safe in an earthquake when we know that these buildings are bad actors in a seismic situation. So that was a really interesting policy that we worked on. Some of the other things that we did were requiring San Francisco's private schools to be evaluated from a seismic standpoint. In the 1970s, we started doing that in California in the public schools, but was never required for the private schools for a host of policy reasons. But being with some bold leadership there, being able to know that over a third of San Francisco youth are in private schools, many of these schools were built before seismic standards. And so requiring that evaluation gave those schools the important tools that they needed to make informed decisions about their risk. So we see a lot of schools undergoing voluntary seismic retrofits right now. And so through that process, it was a really exciting chance to make an impact on my city. But then also through that, I found my next job like the way you wanted to be found. I was poached out of city government by Swinerton Builders in 2016 and came over to work for them. And I've been there ever since. My background does have a lot of that consulting work was for affordable housing developers. So it was sort of a natural niche for me to kind of fall back into that. And I've been working on our affordable housing work ever since then.
Wow. There's so much to unpack there. But let me start with just helping the audience, because sometimes when you hear of like big, gnarly problems, a lot of people get so confused and they get a little bit scared, to be honest with you. Because when they talk about, wow, I have to go and look at the units for 120,000 people and figure out how to get it back to a safe standards, I'm like, just the pure logistics. What if I had to move people out? So it's such a big problem. Like, how did you even start looking at that problem to try to fix it?
Well, I think with any complicated policy solution, it needs to be consensus-based. So I think one of the things that was great about the earthquake safety program that we oversaw in San Francisco was that you had different stakeholders at the table that don't usually sit at the table together. We had the apartment owners association sitting across from the tenants advocacy groups and understanding that, hey, guys, this is a hard problem. There's a reason why we haven't fixed it yet. Let's get there together. And so that means, you give and take in the policy discussion. And as long as the overall arching goal does provide that benefit, sometimes we see public policy that, frankly, because of the infighting, gets so watered down that it's ineffective. So I think that's the real challenge there, is getting the people to the table, but then also having a path forward that really is the right way for everyone. And that's a hard thing to do. But in San Francisco, one of the things we do very well is to get different advocacy groups together to be able to understand where the pain points are and to come up with innovative solutions. You can't just slap a policy on the table and say it's good to go. I mean, you really have to think carefully about, to your point, making sure tenants aren't displaced as a result of trying to make their homes safer, right? Like, what would be the point of that if people are losing their homes in the process? So amending the rent ordinance was part of it to create automatic pass-through hardships and to understand how the property owners have to, protect their cash flow, how if they have to spend a lot of money on a seismic retrofit that they're not planning for, sometimes that could force the sale of a building. So there's very real pain points on kind of all sides of, frankly, every policy issue. And I think some of the thoughtful policymakers that we have, not only in San Francisco, but many of them are now operating at the state level, have brought that lens to their policy development. And I think it just makes for responsible government, no matter what you believe in politics.
Yeah, and I'm just so impressed when you actually see things from strategy through policy, through execution, like all the phases, and actually see it come through life, not just people using it as a soundbite on the news. And tell us maybe one problem that you faced during trying to get all these units back to meeting code and meeting the seismic safety standards. What was the biggest problem? Did you guys worry most about like logistics in terms of relocating residents, or was it financial cost to kind of do all this work?
It was a little bit of everything. If I look at the big buckets, I think let's start with the engineering. So a seismic retrofit of a property historically goes from the foundation to the roof of that structure, right? Any structural engineer will explain why that needs to happen that way. What we were proposing was a partial retrofit. We're in a soft story building. You have a lot of weight above the first floor because of the units and the mass associated with that. But on the ground floor, you either had commercial storefronts or you had a lot of openings for garage doors. In either case, it created sort of a weak first floor. So when you'd have some ground motion, you would see these buildings become collapse prone. Loma Prieta, Northridge, California earthquakes that we've experienced over the years have really seen the deficiencies in that type of construction. So getting the engineering community on board with the idea of a partial retrofit was a really difficult thing to do because structural engineers are historically pretty conservative along those lines. And getting them to do something that's sort of outside of what they've been taught does take some imagination. And the reason why we approached it that way is because if you did do a full seismic retrofit of these buildings, not only would it be cost prohibitive, but you would end up having to work in the residential units. And to your point, you'd end up having to relocate tenants. And that's not what we can do during a housing crisis, right? So the goal first and foremost was to keep tenants in their home during construction, which is little interruption to their services as possible. Retrofitting the ground floor, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right? So there's construction involved. And so relocating parking was a big concern. So again, we addressed that with a standardized compensation across the board. So if a tenant did lose their parking temporarily as a result of the construction, there wasn't an argument over it. We had tenants and landlords agreeing that, hey, this is the right path forward. In similar programs along the capital improvement pass-throughs, the rent ordinance allows work that's required by the city, in this case a seismic retrofit, to be passed through to the tenant. We know most tenants can shoulder that. It's a minimal cost spread over the units, but we also know some can't. And so creating very clear hardship provisions was a big win for the tenant community because this applied to all capital improvement pass-throughs, not just our seismic retrofits. So we use that as an opportunity to help strengthen tenant protections, be able to keep them in their homes. And really everyone agrees that, someone that's on Social Security, someone that's been there long term, there's a whole host of reasons why you wouldn't want to see their rent increased. And so again, try to ask common sense kind of goals and figure out how to get there from the policy perspective was very important. So I'd say kind of balancing the landlord tenant needs, balancing the engineering needs. And the other one was, how are people going to pay for this? That was a really interesting conversation. And previously, the city of San Francisco had proposed a ballot initiative that was a general obligation bond to provide a loan fund for these retrofits. This was sort of an old playbook that had been previously done in the 1990s when the city retrofit their unreinforced masonry buildings, and no one used that program. It was wildly unpopular, hard to qualify for. And so when this ballot initiative came forward, it was the first general obligation bond that I can remember in San Francisco history that did not pass the voters. So when I came on board with the city, we knew we had to take a different approach. We had the benefit of historically low interest rates. So I can't downplay that enough. I mean, that was a huge environment financially for lenders to be able to give money to folks that needed to do these retrofits. And we knew that a centralized loan program wasn't going to be the most effective way. So what we did is we held a financial summit in the mayor's office with the mayor and the heads of every bank that had an office in San Francisco and said, hey, we're not going to tell you what to do. We want you to come to the table with your own creativity, your own underwriting standards. We're not going to pigeonhole you. And what we ended up doing is creating a menu of financing options. In most cases, people were able to refi their house or refi their multifamily building and pull out that money to be able to do the retrofits. But in a lot of other cases, there were short-term loans with, forgivable interest or other products, because at the end of the day, these banks hold the paper on these properties. If they collapse in an earthquake, they're heavily underinsured, right? Most people do not have earthquake insurance. So they quickly saw the risk of their own balance sheets being at risk. So being able to bring everyone to the table, again, kind of in the spirit of full transparency, really created a variety of options for people to be able to finance the solution to their seismic problems.
Wow, I truly love how collaborative that process was. and the framework that you took to just understand, hey, what's the impact on the budget? What's the impact on timing for all these options? And what's the impact on the community for whichever option that we pick? Because I wish people would just take a very structured approach, take emotions out of the equation, and more importantly, bring other people. So it's more invitational, it's more collaborative. And that's how usually you come up with the best solutions. Oh, wow, that was so good. So let's kind of fast forward. So then you got poached into Swinerton, and you didn't start working on residential right away, right? How did you fall into this world of becoming sort of the lead for affordable housing for the country?
Yeah, so when I came over to Swinerton, most of my career has been downtown high-rise work. So I'm very comfortable in that space. And I was a project manager on a downtown mixed-use office and residential high-rise. Working on that project for several years, it was great. And it was very intentional from my partners at Swinerton, to kind of put me into that role to really understand our systems. I was very familiar with the company. I was very familiar with the industry in general, but to be able to understand how we build our buildings at Swinerton was very important for me to get that background. And then we got hit by COVID. COVID changed the world in terms of the construction market in a big way. Many of our projects kept going because they were deemed essential, whether they were healthcare, whether they were critical housing, whether they were in a situation where you were pouring a foundation and needed to keep going. So from a company standpoint, we kept very busy throughout the pandemic, but we also saw the market changing. And knowing that we had done affordable housing work at Swinerton for a long time, but frankly, really treated it like it was just another residential building. And the reality is that client base is different, that tenant base is different, that financing is different. And so we took a more structured approach and actually said, okay, let's create this as one of our core target markets. And so for about the last 4 years, it's been a national market for us. So while we've done a lot of that work historically in places like California, places like Washington and Hawaii, now we're starting to see a lot more of it in places like Austin and in Denver and Atlanta and Charlotte and other markets that we're in. Turns out the housing crisis didn't stop at the California border. So to know that this keeps going and it impacts every community in the United States in a big way and continues to impact it, it was a way for us to be furthering our mission of being invested in the communities that we serve already from a construction standpoint, but also putting the women and men in our labor force to work on these projects has been incredibly rewarding. When I talk to a foreman of ours who might work on, a market rate project or an office building, and then they spend some time on an affordable housing development, it really changes their perspective on things. And while they might not be the beautiful glass towers that we sometimes build in our industry, they're products that provide such a huge benefit to our community, and you really start to get the buy-in. And us being an employee-owned firm, that definitely plays into that a lot. We take a lot of pride in the ownership of our company, and to see that play out in our communities, it's frankly a really exciting thing to see.
Wow. Like my heart just feels so warm when I heard you tell the story about how your foreman just kind of see that home come to life and the residents move in. That's so freaking cool, man. That's so rewarding. And to that end, you talked a little about financing, learning how this whole world of affordable works. Let me kind of ask it more straightforwardly. How are people getting projects built nowadays? Like what sort of creative methods are you seeing being implemented that are actually helping developers make a deal pencil?
Well, let's talk about the tools that we already have, right? Low-income housing tax credits is probably the most common vehicle that we see to provide partial financing for affordable housing development. When you think about how advanced we are as a society here in 2025, and to think that the reason why we have low-income housing tax credits is because of tax reform that happened in the 1980s, that makes you sort of scratch your head and wonder if that is the most effective way. And the reality is that does get units built. Low-income housing tax credits have been incredibly successful, but we also see their limitations. We sort of scoff and say, why does it take 10 years to develop an affordable housing building? And that's frankly because the site control is so complicated. The capital stack that you have to piece together, those low-income housing tax credits are only a certain chunk of that capital stack. So to understand other funding sources, other equity, other municipalities that are kicking in money from various programs, all of those have different requirements and different performance metrics that one has to consider. So putting that together is incredibly complicated. The nonprofit affordable housing developers that are the majority of my clients are incredible people because they're so dedicated to that mission. They're mission-driven people. they're in that world to make a difference. They do a lot with very little in terms of how they put their projects together. So I do think it's a tremendous opportunity for us to build more housing, but it's not building housing at the rate to make a difference. The fact is that we have been underbuilding housing as communities for decades, for a generation. And to be able to see that limited by how many tax credits are available, how many dollars are available, how can you get your investors to go do it? There's got to be another way. And we're seeing some innovations happen. We built our first workforce housing project in the city of Seattle a few years ago. That was a project that used no tax credits. And so there are some very smart people out there, but the reality is we're in tough economic times to make any project pencil, regardless of its occupancy. So because of historically high interest rates, because of tariffs, because of a lot of other issues, there are challenges in the industry that cascade down into the affordable housing space and make work that is already very difficult even more difficult. So those are some of the pain points in putting one of those projects together.
And you talked about how you built a workforce housing project in Seattle with no tax credits. Help people understand, how did you guys make that happen? Because sometimes people are an affordable project with no tax credits? We haven't heard of it before. So how did you guys pull that off?
Sure. And admittedly, it is a bit of a unicorn of a deal. And Swinerton, we really can't take credit for that. The real genius behind it was Skipstone Development and a person named AP Hurd, along with their partners at Community Roots Housing. Being able to execute a plan on a site, a property that the organization already owned, helped. We already had site control. Being able to get innovation grants for the use of mass timber helped offset some of the pre-con costs. And so there were things along the way that were really part of the tried and true kind of typical way you'd approach an affordable housing development, but there were also these alternatives. So I think we were all challenged in a lot of different ways to think outside of the box, which is really, frankly, where I think the future is going. I think we will always build tax credit housing. I think unless we do major tax reform again as a society, we're going to always see that as a tool. But again, it's part of the solution. It is not the solution. So we need to see, frankly, housing built at all income levels. When we see the affordable housing space, we see everything from formerly homeless folks that are just coming off the street to workforce housing that's at 120% of AMI and everything in between. And that's really what you need to see. You need to see that healthy mix of housing options for people to have a society thrive.
And that's so interesting. And you mentioned that they already owned the site for that project. So that probably gave them a little bit more equity to go get the construction loan, to go build the project. And then you also mentioned that they got innovation grants from the use of mass timber to offset some of the pre-con costs. Help people understand, what are pre-construction costs first and foremost. Let's define that for people that don't understand it. And what sort of creativity are people able to apply that you have seen work?
Sure. So in any affordable housing development, you're going to have a pre-development period, whether you're doing pre-construction, whether you're doing procurement. It's the stuff that happens before the shovels go in the ground, right? So during that period, most developers, especially affordable housing developers, have very limited pre-development funds. And that's a major challenge, because we believe that putting the proper planning into your pre-construction process allows you to begin construction and not have any hiccups. You identify your known unknowns. You start to quantify those. You get a solid buyout with trade partners. So that way, when you start turning dirt on your project, you stick to the plan and everybody wins. When you're building a market rate development or you're building some other kind of occupancy, the tendency to change things midstream happens all the time. You'll see on a market rate development, there might be a new trend in the amenity space that developer wants to capture. So all of a sudden you're repricing something, you're reorganizing work, you're breaking your schedule and rebuilding it in the middle of that process. That costs you time and that costs you money. Affordable housing developers have neither of those. They have very strict requirements to start construction and complete construction, depending on their tax credits or other financing sources they might be accessing. And again, kind of developing that plan and sticking to it. There's no tolerance for change orders. When they get that financing capital stack complete, it's not like there's a magical 20% that's on top of it that we don't know about, right? So it's working within their budget to be smart about how we identify those items that we can value engineer, but also balance policies like providing meaningful work opportunities for people in our community that work for disadvantaged businesses. So being able to kind of mix all that together in a smart plan really has to happen before you start construction. If you're trying to do that midstream, it's going to fail in almost every single instance.
Yeah, and I want to call out that a lot of times there's significant capital at risk for a developer. They are probably borrowing private money, private sources, or relying on grants just to hire your architects, your engineers, to get your drawings in place, to get your conceptual drawings. And all this stuff costs money. And especially if you're trying to pursue a low-income housing tax credit project where you're putting in an application, you might be spending $250,000, $500,000 in fees just so you can hope and pray that you get the tax credits that you can use to build your project. And that's why it's so risky for so many developers, especially if you don't have site control. And even if you have site control, you're asking the landowner that's contributing their land to wait on the sideline for 6 months, 12 months, sometimes even years, because if you don't win it the first time around, you might have to wait until the next annual cycle. And that's what drives so much risk. It's that uncertainty of whether or not you're going to get the tax credits and also whether or not you're even going to get the project approved in that situation. So I bet you see that all the time.
We absolutely do. And we have projects. First of all, it's not uncommon for the typical affordable housing development to spend about 18 to 24 months in that pre-construction period. Frankly, that time is good for us because we can line it up to be able to execute. But then what happens when you hit the end of that 18, 24 months and then you find out they didn't get their tax credits? And then that deadline is all of a sudden, we're extended another year in some cases. We always know those projects are going to get built. We've never had a project that is, sort of entitled and falls off the boards from the affordable housing space. It's really about waiting and making sure that that financing is put in place. And that's an unknown variable to a large degree. The challenge for us as general contractors is to be diligent with those pre-construction dollars, because frankly, all of those developments don't have the amount of pre-construction funds that we need to be successful there anyway. So a lot of times we will take a hit during pre-con because we know it serves our best interest to have a good plan for our client. But when those get extended a year and we're still doing pricing and buyout and updating our trade packages, that's where we have to be very careful because we already are limited with those pre-development dollars. And that's true for pretty much everyone at the table during that period. Same thing with the architect managing their design fees and anything that's going to happen before you close on your permanent construction loan that allows you to start funding the actual project. So we find that's a real tough space for our affordable housing developers. And we've come up with some tools to help kind of ease that cash flow burden that happens during pre-construction with the understanding that once we start, we're going to have a great plan and we're going to be successful together.
And I think this is why having such a great partner that knows what they're doing is so crucial for any project to be successful. So when you talk a little bit about how Swinerton, being the great partner that you guys are, takes a little hit during the pre-construction phase, what does that mean? Are you fronting some of the pre-development costs to kind of help usher along the process to get it approved? What did you mean exactly?
Yeah, sometimes there's a few different tools. Sometimes we just heavily discount it right off the top, and we know that it's in our benefit to have robust and professional pre-construction services. And while sometimes the client may not either value that or may not be able to afford that, we're sort of agnostic there. We know that it sets us up for success, so we're going to do it no matter what. So sometimes that means, taking a significant discount to our pre-construction fees, depending on what their pre-development budget looks like. Sometimes that means pushing our pre-construction fees off until the close of construction loans. So that way, when you get your financing, you're paying us back for pre-construction services. There's other ways to do that in a way, but also the amount of money you can save during that by doing intelligent value engineering, by working collaboratively with the architect, you can drive a lot of money out of that project into shared savings for the owner.
And I love how you kind of explain all the different levers that you can pull. And I wish people would just understand that, you could discount your services, but you can also defer some of your fees until the construction loan fund so that you can start paying back any of the debts that you have incurred for the pre-construction services that you have incurred throughout the entire process. But this is why it's so good, because it shows how great of a partner you guys are, because you guys want to get the planning right in the beginning so you can set yourself up for success. Because what's the saying? It's like, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And that's so key to what I'm hearing right now. It's you guys understand, you know what you're doing, and you want to make sure you prepare your clients for that long road ahead, because getting the deal funded is a big milestone, but then the real work actually has to begin. You actually got to stick to schedules and timelines and make sure people are performing and showing up on the site when they're supposed to.
And to that end, it's important that we get a phone call after the project is done. About 80% of our work we do at Swinerton is with repeat clients. And I think taking the long view, we've been in business for 137 years. And to understand that, sure, we could play games, we could lowball, we could win that project, But if you play that game and you do those tricks in the beginning, the client, first of all, it's going to be an unhappy relationship from the very beginning. It's going to create an adversarial nature on the job that no one enjoys on any side. The people running the job aren't going to have enough money in the job from a construction standpoint. The developer is going to be getting hit with change orders. Sure, you'll get that job done. Sure, you'll make money, but you will not get a phone call back and you will not get a reference check for the next job. So, you have to take the long view on these projects. We love the fact that we get repeat business with some of the best clients in the affordable housing space. And frankly, that's because of the transparency and dedication our teams bring to every project.
So good. And I want to wrap up the pre-development phase, but help people understand what sort of services can Swinerton provide during the pre-construction phase. Are you kind of like, is it all in-house? You guys have all the resources for the engineering and all the pre-development services?
So we are a very dynamic firm. From a self-perform standpoint, we self-perform many major trades by ourselves, right? We do structural concrete, we do drywall, we do doors, frames, and hardware, we do rough and finish carpentry, we do demolition, we do millwork, we do mass timber setting, we do modular housing setting, and the list goes on and on. So being able to have those agreements in place between our teams to be able to understand what current market costs are a huge advantage to us, because we know where the wind is blowing, what that labor rate's going to be for that particular trade, what those union requirements are, what those prevailing wage requirements are, depending on where we're at and what we're working on. That helps inform it. But also there's a big piece of that involves the community. So I think during that pre-development phase, making sure we clearly understand what any hiring goals might be, whether we're hiring workers from a HUD Section 3 list, or whether we have anywhere from 25 to 50% of the project budget set aside for small businesses, depending on where we're at in the program. Sometimes those are local business enterprises. Sometimes those are minority business enterprises. And Swinerton prides themselves on being embedded in that community. So when we do have hiring goals or subcontracting goals like that, it's not the first phone call we're making. We sit around the table a lot and talk about how peers in our space will do a good fake effort instead of a good faith effort. And, I just see too many contractors kind of let that roll off, or they complain that it adds cost to the job. I don't buy that. If you're in the community and you're a true community partner and you have those relationships, those folks are showing up on your job site, whether or not there's a subcontracting goal. And so to be able to be in that space with authenticity really matters. And I think it matters to the way that our subs treat us, the way that they give us pricing because they know we're going to take care of them. That's an important link in the process to developing and executing successful affordable housing in my mind.
Yeah, and there's so many different elements to this. So I kind of want to get into, you mentioned about mass timber, right? You guys talk about modular setting and all these different approaches to building all factor into making a deal work, because you have to understand it's a long list of expenses to build an apartment building. But how should people approach understanding, hey, how should I build this building, right? Obviously, we engage you in the beginning to kind of think through the different options, but help walk through folks, like what are the different options that you're seeing that's generating success, that's keeping costs manageable and predictable?
I think what's important from a general contractor role is to not pigeonhole the design team or the client into a particular construction typology. I think as experts in the space, our job is to show them the pros and cons associated with each and to let them make that decision. I think our job is to provide accurate information with a holistic view so that way they can understand it. I mean, currently our company is building the range of housing, right? Whether we're doing, traditional stick frame housing, whether we're doing podium construction with conventional framing above, whether we're doing all concrete, whether we're doing all mass timber, whether we're doing structural steel. We see all of that every day in our day-to-day lives. And so we understand that intimately from a construction standpoint and what that costs for the parts and pieces and for the labor, but also trying to think more holistically of what does it cost for that owner to insure that building after we're gone, and to think further down that life cycle and to really help them make decisions on factors that they may not be considering. And again, it's a challenge in the affordable housing space because you're working with those limited dollars. There's a way that they think might be the right approach, and maybe it is right. It's not our job to say it's wrong, Our job is to set the table, look at all those options, and for them to be able to say, okay, now I have the information I need to make an informed decision about how to move forward. That's the true partnership in that space that I think is really successful. So could we build any construction type and make it work? Absolutely. I really want our clients to have a good experience, and I want our clients to be building the product that they need to build for their portfolio to hang on to for long-term assets. And to really think through what that life cycle looks like is really, frankly, I think a differentiator between Swinerton and our peers in the space.
Wow. Usually people will just look at, we're just going to build this project modular because it's supposed to be stacking like Lego blocks and it should go up really, really fast. But you think way more ahead, not just in terms of time, in terms of budget, but you even help them think about the downstream insurance costs for what it takes to insure that building over the life cycle of that building. That shows me that you guys are really in tune with the level of details throughout the entire process, because you help them think way downstream versus some other GCs might just be like, oh no, that's the way we go. That's $300 a square foot. It'll take you 18 months, blah, 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 blah. And that's usually what people do. But you guys help them think way further ahead. So tell us, maybe I'll phrase this question this way. What are the questions that a developer should ask you that they might not typically ask, especially when they're comparing all these different options between like podium, concrete, all mass timber, all structural steel? Like, any sort of questions that you think your clients should be asking you, but sometimes they don't?
Yeah, and if we look at the typical affordable housing development, right, there's really innovative developments out there that are providing affordable home ownership, which I think is an amazing way to build generational wealth. But that's not the typical product. The typical product is essentially an apartment building, right? That's in compliance. And so that developer is almost always the long-term owner of that property. So thinking through that is really important, but also looking at, so first of all, what does the architect say, right? They hired the architect for a reason. These are design professionals that we absolutely respect in the space. So, we try to start with that as a baseline. What is the architect proposing? And then from there, we can provide some basic constructability feedback. Hey, this detail could save you a lot of money because you have to do this 50 times on this building. And if you simplify it, you're saving a bunch of money. Kind of typical contractor value engineering happens, but also looking at the different pain points. We build a lot of modular housing, and modular is a great solution in the industry. But the reality is you need a big upfront deposit to pay the factory, whoever's building your mods. And as we discussed earlier, a lot of times these developments don't have the pre-development funds they need to be able to get in on that deposit. You see other issues come up, but in that situation, right now we're building a farm worker housing development with our partners at EAH in the Salinas Valley. Modular's been an excellent choice for that because it's a part of the state that has a smaller sub base, and we can be sort of lighter on the land, as we say, with a smaller crew to be able to set those modular units and build that development more efficiently. It's not always the most efficient case, right? So I think talking about each project individually, looking at what the community wants. One of the things that I've seen happen, let's say in the last 5 to 7 years, which has been really interesting, is the development of local density bonuses or state density bonuses. So properties that were previously, 4 or 5 stories in height can now be high rises. And I think that's so interesting because, first of all, it's a higher use for that land. You're able to co-locate affordable housing near critical services and transportation, which should already be happening, but unfortunately it hasn't been. A lot of times our affordable housing communities are built in sort of deserts around without any food service, without any groceries, without any transit, without any health services. Being smart about where we locate those, because frankly, everybody that's in an affordable housing development is part of our community. They need to be integrated well into our community. And that's how we see this sea change that's happening right now. I can remember being much younger and being in this space and sort of people thinking differently about that. So the idea that we can build bigger, build taller, get more units onto a site is beneficial in a lot of ways. First of all, you're taking a bigger bite out of the housing crisis. But second of all, you're able to spread those construction costs across more units and ultimately get that cost per unit into a better place that meets that developer's pro forma. We've seen that happen multiple times where we can get intelligent with space planning, maybe squeeze another floor of units in. That extra floor of units totally flips the game, right? It's a really interesting way to try to do it because at the end of the day, we're not going to solve the housing crisis by building duplexes. They're part of that solution, right? They provide housing, so I'm not, totally against it, but you're not making the impact the way that you do if you build a 200 unit building or a 400 unit building, which is really the scale we need to be thinking about when we talk about housing production in the United States.
And see, this is why I wanted you to come on this podcast so bad, Patrick, man. Because these are the creative thoughts and the way you approach a deal. Because I always tell people that, hey, a deal that might not be a deal for your luxury Class A development, it might be a deal for an affordable deal if you have the right partners. Meaning you might have someone like Patrick helping you look at a deal and saying, hey, all of a sudden we can squeeze an extra 4 because of the design or how we can value engineer the entire process, because now you get an extra 4 units. And now all of a sudden you have enough income from your rental units to service the underlying debt, because that's the number one problem that when people say, hey, does this deal pencil? It really means whether or not that project has an ability to generate enough revenue to cover the underlying debt service on that land. Sometimes it might be a 1.15 debt service coverage ratio, it might be 1.25, just depending on the type of loan products that you have. But that's what it takes. I wanted you to come on because, Patrick, you talked so much about all the different levers you can pull, from the pre-construction levers to the way you approach building it, whether that's modular. Hey, maybe it's faster, but you need a bigger upfront deposit. So now you're really educating everyone on exactly how to make these decisions with all the information with an experienced partner by their side. This is so freaking good, man. Can you tell I'm freaking jazzed about this, man? This is freaking exciting, dude. Oh my God. I love geeking out about development. So, all right, let's keep going, Patrick, because I want to let's talk about mass timber, because you talked a little bit about earlier. Not a lot of people know what mass timber is even. So Patrick, tell us a little bit about what sort of innovation you're seeing in that space and how you guys are bringing that to market.
Sure. Yeah. What excites us about mass timber is frankly the environmental benefit that it provides. It is the most sustainable and the most renewable resource that we can use in the construction industry. Sometimes that's hard for people to wrap their head around because they think of the images of when we were younger and you'd hear about clear cutting of forests to make wood product. But what's happening now is really exciting in the mass timber space. And it's not exactly new technology, right? Other countries have been building with mass timber for years. It's been a hotbed of construction in the Pacific Northwest. As a general contractor, we've completed over 65 mass timber buildings, which I believe is more than any other GC in the United States. And so we're really committed to that technology for a few reasons. We like that there's heavily influenced by prefabrication. The idea that we can take raw lumber, whether that's a piece of glulam or whether that's a piece of CLT, bring it to our fabrication facility, set it up with the hardware, ship it out to our job sites, and it goes up very quickly. It's great for urban infill sites. It's very quiet as it goes up. And so from the construction logistics standpoint, we really see that benefit. No other material that we build with in our industry can tell that sustainability story like mass timber can. But then let's talk about what the product at the end of the day looks like. So then you're walking into, whether it's a residential unit or whether it's an office building, wherever we're building mass timber, you walk in and all of a sudden you get that smell, you get that feel that and we call it biophilia, right? So you're that exposure to wood kind of does something in your system that kind of puts you at ease. It puts you in a calmer state. And we've seen a lot of studies that are starting to emerge. So say you have surgery and you're recovering in a mass timber room. Your recovery is actually going to be faster than if you're in a room that's concrete and drywall. Now, much smarter people than us are going to have to quantify that to understand how it really works out. But you think of that overall concept being applied to any type of affordable housing. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about folks coming right off the street or you're talking about higher end workforce housing or anything in between. That idea that you're trying to give these people a leg up for whatever reason. And to be able to do that in something so equitable that has that not only that environmental benefit from the actual construction, but then just the feeling that you're going to get living in that unit, that's huge. Again, it's a hard thing to quantify, but it's one of the things that we're really excited about as we see more and more of this being adopted in the community. But also at some point, I feel like we've been building with concrete for 140 years. We're going to continue to build with concrete. It's a great building material, has a pretty nasty carbon footprint. And at some point, our building codes are going to catch up to that. And I believe strongly that at some point, our building codes are going to talk about embodied carbon. And when we think about that, it's a total game changer for this technology. So as a company, we've invested heavily building our own CLT manufacturing plant, which is topping out its construction next week. We'll be online in 2026. We have 2 glulam manufacturers, we have a sawmill, and we have 2 fabrication facilities, one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast, to help serve the domestic supply of mass timber that, frankly, we see as the future of construction.
Whoa, that is a massive operation to not just be a GC firm, but also to sort of have your own manufacturing operation to kind of generate all the supply. So for people that don't really understand, like, hey, difference between mass timber, difference between concrete, difference between modular, are there one or two typical pros and cons of each one that you can possibly share with us today? Let's go through mass timber. Like, what type of project is it best suited for, and what might be the downfall of it?
So to date, mass timber has been seen as a bit of a premium in the industry. Now that is changing day by day with the amount of domestic supply that's available, with the other amount of providers that are able to put product into the marketplace. That supply and demand curve is constantly in flux. So we're seeing those prices normalize over time. Overall, capitalizing and getting the finance stack for a mass timber building may be more difficult than, say, a concrete building. So when the developer is going through that triage of kind of figuring out what they want to build, if they're going to build mass timber, usually they have a strong commitment, whether it's organizationally or personally, to sustainability. That's something that's upfront and part of why they're putting their money where their mouth is. The reality is if we're looking at high density, affordable housing, concrete tends to make the most sense from a development standpoint today. The reason being is that we see the speed of construction with concrete. We can do anywhere from 3 to 5 day pour cycles. So your floors are going up much faster than, say, a conventional wood frame building or other types of approaches. So you have that going. You're able to maximize that floor ceiling space. So you're getting the most amount of units with proper head height in the smallest amount of building possible, which allows you to save money on your exterior skin and other systems throughout the process. So, being smart about your structure has cascading impacts to how you build the rest of it. Now, the other side of that is thinking about long-term insurance. We've seen a lot of our clients that would traditionally build a conventional stick frame product looking more at concrete because of this insurance savings on permanent property insurance over the course of, say, 10 years. We did some modeling for a client on a 7-story building. Again, it could be, it was originally podium with sort of stick framing above. And we looked at that compared to a concrete approach. Concrete saved them time because the construction schedule was faster due to concrete structure. But also our builder's risk policy that we carried during that project was roughly a third of the cost for non-combustible construction versus something like wood framing. And then you pass that along to permanent property insurance. A concrete building, the same hypothetical building, save the client close to $5 million over the course of 10 years of owning that building. So again, you might have a development lead that's thinking about the construction cost, but a lot of times the development part of that company doesn't always talk to the asset management part of that company. And having conversations between those silos is really important because that may not be a pain point for someone, but it also may be a deal killer for someone. So again, we don't come in with the approach saying, hey, you must do this because this is why we think it makes sense. We're saying, these are the pros and cons of these different approaches. We can build them all for you. It's your choice. But we want you to make sure you understand what the pros and cons are with each path forward that you might take.
And just like that, if you save $500,000 on an annual basis for your insurance expenses, you divide that on a 5.5 cap rate, you're adding $9 million of value to your property. That's huge. From someone like Swinerton, like Patrick's team, helping you understand throughout the entire process what's your overall savings, not just on your time to build, but also way downstream. So I love that we just brought that entire concept together, Patrick, and made it really real for people with actual numbers to talk it through. So we talked about mass timber, we talked about concrete, traditional stick frame. What about modular? You hear about modular so often. You mentioned one of the cons is having a big down payment for that deposit so you can get the plan up. Is it truly a lot faster to build with modular? What have you seen?
When modular projects are done correctly, they're amazing. What I've seen is there's folks in the industry that are trying it for the first time, or as a retired friend of mine who was in the affordable housing development said, they never want to pay the dumb tax, right? They never want to be the first person to come out the gate and try something. So we've seen a lot of modular projects go wrong too. Luckily, the ones at Swinerton that we've built have all been very successful. And I think it's because we choose good partners from the beginning. But it's very hard when you look at the different factories, right? There's a handful of factories on the West Coast that provide volumetric modular for our projects. We know them all individually. We've pre-qualified them. We understand their bonding capability. We understand what their supply chain looks like. What happens a lot of times with a new factory is they're usually propped up by some sort of venture capitalist funding or other investors. So they don't have that track record of actually building projects, which makes them, from a supplier standpoint, we treat them just in a lot of ways, just like any other supplier, someone that I'm buying structural steel from, or someone that I'm buying mechanical equipment from. So they still have to check all the boxes in terms of what it means for them to be, frankly, a sound financial partner with us. And so we see a lot of the growing pains that happen, and we've found some innovative ways to help them. In some situations where, say, a factory wasn't able to cover the bond because of the size of the job, we'll lend our balance sheet support as Swinerton to be able to help make that project go. Does that incur additional risk for us? Absolutely. So we have to be measured on how we do that. But I think modular is a great solution. You see it be somewhat contentious in some cities. In some cases, you've seen, depending on the labor situation in a particular geography, folks come out from the building trades to speak against it. Frankly, I think it's a little tone deaf, in my opinion. I understand where they're coming from on it, but I don't think the propensity of modular construction is going to put union labor out of business. We are a signatory union general contractor in California, and I kind of think they're failing to see the forest through the trees, in my opinion. Again, it's a partial solution. It is not the solution. None of these typologies are the be-all, end-all of fixing our housing crisis. They all have to work in harmony with one another, and they all have their place in our society.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And obviously, speed is a big item when it comes to modular. Are there any limitations to how dense or how high a modular building can go?
Most modular that we see in California is built in what they call Type 5 construction. So that means it's using conventional wood framing, it's using 2x4s. So the reality is the mass and volume of that building is limited like any other conventional wood frame, or maybe it's over a podium, but it meets the same definitions in Chapter 5 of the building code of how big you can build it based on the construction type. Now, there are other modular companies out there that are using non-combustible materials. That changes the game. If you start to pigeon yourself into a Type 1 or Type 2 construction type, then all of a sudden your height and bulk can get much larger based on the allowances in the building code. So it's really about understanding the size and matching your construction technology appropriately with the mass of the building.
So good. Man, I have so many more questions for you, man, but this has just been too fun. And let me kind of ask you a couple of different things, and I'll set it up with this question because, Patrick, when I started this podcast 3 years ago, right, a lot of people said, Kent, you're never going to be able to solve this affordable housing problem. And I told them, hey, I beg to differ. I think it's just a matter of time before we collect all the pieces to the puzzle, because even if we don't solve it in our lifetime, we can pass all the pieces to the next generation. They just pick it up from where we left off. And I view you as such a big piece of that puzzle, Patrick, because you came on, you were so open with information. You shared knowledge that people can't even get in like a master's degree in real estate development, to be honest with you. And this is the reason why we started a podcast. People like you come on that are so open and so willing to help other people that might just be hoping for a career to make an impact in affordable housing. Now they can at least have some base knowledge of like, okay, this is how Patrick got his career in affordable housing. I want to help people. Maybe this is the path I take. But I want to kind of hear from you because you have such a depth of experience from city and on the private side. Why do you think affordable housing, particularly the lack of supply of affordable housing, has just like been so hard to solve for?
I think there is a big social sea change that we're seeing right in front of our eyes. I can remember when I was a child growing up, if people talked about, let's use ADUs as an example, right? We don't build ADUs, but I find it fascinating from a construction standpoint, right? These were sort of the political third rail for a lot of years. You talk about either legalizing an in-law unit that might have been in your property, or God forbid, building an ADU in your backyard. We saw elected politicians be thrown out of office for proposing such a crazy idea. And now it's commonplace everywhere in California. And you're seeing it more so throughout the United States. This is a wonderful solution to add light density to our neighborhoods. So I see these things that previously, and whether it's because, our parents raised us with a particular worldview that was based on their parents' worldview. And you start to see this idea that because we had single family home zoning, that it needed to stay that way for a variety of reasons. Most of those reasons were dog whistles to a time where certain people weren't allowed to be in certain communities. So I think there's a big reckoning that's happening right now where we have to realize that the land use policies in this country historically are very exclusionary and very racist. And the fact that we've had great leaders undoing those policies and making it right for everybody to have a dignified place to live, no matter who they are or what they look like, that's something that is really exciting now, because I think a lot of people talked that way, but now you're seeing people bet that way. You're seeing people say, this is why we're building this building at this density in this neighborhood, to be able to provide meaningful living opportunities for our community that's already here. Former Mayor London Breed, it was a project that I wasn't working on, but I was very interested in the development. It was a dense family affordable housing building being built on the west side of San Francisco, which traditionally is mostly single family homes and duplexes. And there was a faction of the community that was upset with the and keep in mind, this is a mid-density building. This is not some high rise, right? And the mayor came out there and silenced the room by just saying, I don't understand why you guys hate families. And it was silent. She goes, all we're trying to do is provide homes for the families that already live in this neighborhood. I don't understand what the big deal is. So to see leadership like that at the political level is so encouraging, because we're calling ourselves out. We can't think about the way that we've done land use like it's the 1950s anymore. We have to be more inclusive. We have to understand that not only do we have population growth, but we have a lack of production. Those two things together create the housing crisis. And we haven't even really dug into the fact that now we're seeing the pipeline of people going into homelessness increase as well, right? We're seeing a lot of cuts to direct aid programs that were that extra $100, $200 a month that kept you in the space of housing security, that now these people are losing their homes. They're becoming homeless. And once someone gets there, all your outcomes change dramatically. And frankly, the cost to house that person is exponentially more expensive than if we were just helping keep them in their home to begin with. So I think this view of kind of how we've created this paradox around social services, around mental health access, around housing access, really has to think more holistically on, frankly, we can be more responsible with our dollars if we're smart about our housing pipeline and our policy and how we care for the most vulnerable in our society.
Oh, I just loved how you talk about being responsible with our dollars and being wise with how we allocate our resources, because that's so critical. And it's just like all these, I love how you brought up the ADU analogy, because you can kind of see how the sentiment has changed over the years. It's kind of like when people used to talk about Section 8 of public housing, it was always associated with like the ghetto, drugs, guns, drama. But honestly, my mom was just someone that lived in Section 8 housing, and she was just a hardworking person that was just trying to put food on the table. That was it. Working class families. That's it. And I loved how you kind of shared the progress of sentiment changing. So as with your experience, right, I'm starting to see cities now becoming more wise with their surplus land, with sort of also becoming developers themselves. What sort of perspective can you share, or tips might you provide for cities to make sure that if they are becoming developers themselves now, the city itself, what kind of mistakes should they steer clear of, for lack of better words?
I think the biggest mistake they could do is limit themselves in their thinking. I had the benefit of sort of being in the room when Mayor Edwin Lee really rethought how we were going to approach affordable housing in San Francisco. And that model has really exponentially grown and been adopted by many other cities at a huge success rate. The city of San Francisco was the first city to start saying, hey, we have excess land that really isn't being planned for right now. Let's build affordable housing on it. And that sounds like a wild concept at the time, but guess what? That's what we're doing all over California now. You see the state doing their own Surplus Land Act and Excess Sites Land Act. And to be able to just take that concept, which maybe 10 years ago would have sounded ludicrous in a community meeting, but now everyone's in full support of it. And to watch that happen, and then not only see that, but to see the units getting built and the people living there and the thousands of affordable housing units that have been added as a result of that innovative thinking is huge. Also the idea of trying to figure out how we create local financing sources. City of San Francisco created the first affordable housing trust fund, and now almost every major city that's looking at this has created a similar equivalent financial vehicle to be able to help fund their own construction of affordable housing when they don't have affordable housing developers doing it on their own or in conjunction with them. Again, kind of thinking that, getting all the people to the table and trying to pull on any good thread that might create units for us I think is incredibly beneficial. We also see this a lot in the interim transitional housing space. At Swinerton, we build a lot of those types of communities, and these aren't what we would consider permanent housing, right? These are intended to be temporary. People live here anywhere from 6 months to 5 years, depending on the community. It's a small home, typically with a bed, a desk, a door, and a lock, common bathing facilities, common kitchen facilities. We can house people in that format at a tenth of the cost that we spend on permanent affordable housing. Again, I'm not saying that that's the solution and that people should stay there forever. I'm saying that that is something that affects the outcomes in a tremendous way of people that are experiencing street homelessness to get them housed. Because frankly, it's a little foolish to think that someone on the streets is going to wait 10 years for that permanent affordable housing building to get built and move into it. By that time, the trauma that they have experienced on the street can't be undone. Right. So this is a crisis in its truest form where that speed is really important. That day that that person starts experiencing homelessness, we need to be focusing on getting them a bed in a safe environment so we can avoid the trauma that's going to be that would be actually prevent them from coming back and integrating into society after they experience this crisis. It's a huge holistic pipeline of not only, housing, nuts and bolts housing, but mental health and services combined with that is really where we need to be thinking. And again, we could do all that at a fraction of the cost for what we spend on trying to provide services in the emergency room for folks that are experiencing homelessness and other things that create a huge cost burden to our society, when really we can be more intelligent with that money and provide better outcomes for these people. That's how we need to be thinking about it.
See, this is such a comprehensive answer, and it just shows you how multifaceted it is, right? I love that you kind of expanded on it costs us more money to support a homeless person than if we just prevented that person from ever ending up on the street in the first place. I used to be an EMT. I used to be the person that was taking a homeless person to the emergency room, and I could see every single taxi ride is what they call it, the ambulance at that point, it's like $1,000. Plus you have an ER stay. Mm-hmm. And it's just getting wiser, right? When I used to be in corporate America, we had this saying called stop the bleeding. You got to stop the bleeding. You got to stabilize the situation. And you got to figure out, hey, how do I allocate my resources that gives me the best return, not just on investment, but for the return for the community, the experience, the engagement, so that people can actually feel the change. They don't want to go downstairs and walk their dog at a downtown high rise and only see homeless folks around them. It's not the community that anyone would ever want to build, especially if we can address it more upstream. So, Patrick, I loved all the topics we covered today, man. I'm so glad you talked about how you were part of San Francisco when they were being super innovative and kind of leading in charge, creating one of the first affordable housing trust funds in the United States. That's a level of innovation that we need to see. And it's almost like that seemed like such a wild idea, but it seems so much common sense now when I talk about it out loud with you. And it's almost like people just need to understand, okay, we kind of know what the answer is. It's kind of like, hey, we know for us to lose weight, we got to eat less and exercise. Well, you want to build more housing, you need more resources, you need more financing, you need more land. So how do you become more wise with that decision, with those resources? And it's almost as if you have to just take a bite out of something that's very difficult and just execute. Yeah, it's going to be hard to manage it, but you got to figure out what is the right incentive structure to put the right resources in place so that you can be very wise with the land that you have as a city, which is very limited, especially in California, build the housing, but also manage it really well so it never falls into this disarray or this notion of public housing that's all low income. We can create vibrant mixed income communities. We can do that. And I think having a partner like you at Swinerton is going to be so key for anyone that's thinking about taking on that journey. And Patrick, this has been so fun, man. I'm so grateful for you coming on today, Patrick. Seriously, without people like you, I would never have the home I grew up in, man. So I appreciate you so much for coming on and making the dream of development just feel a little bit more achievable. So for so many people out there that's listening.
Well, I appreciate you, Kent, and the work that you're doing here too. This is important, getting the word out.
Man, hey, Patrick, so if people want to reach out to you or maybe they have a project, like how can they get in touch with you?
Easiest way is Swinerton.com. You can see a lot of the affordable housing work that we're doing there. I'm also very easily findable and available to help with anything, regardless if it's a project of ours. I think that's the misconception. We're not just getting into this because we see a financial gain as a project standpoint. We are invested in making sure that people have places to live. As an employer that has more than 4,000 folks working for us, many of these folks are in craft labor. Being able to make sure that they have a house to live in is just as important as the buildings that we're building for our clients. So thinking about that through and through is really at the core, frankly, of what we do.
And layup question for you. When should they get in touch with you guys? Is it as early as possible?
Absolutely. Yeah. And even a concept, just trying to get to the table. And if it's something that, we can't even help with, we're very transparent about being able to help show and steer people towards the resources that are going to be the best fit for them. So this is not a play for us to capitalize on that market in that way. It's really to be able to source the right and best solutions for housing in our community.
All right. This has been so fun. You guys, make sure you follow Patrick on LinkedIn. Make sure you check out Swinerton's website. I mean, this has just been such a valuable conversation full of gems, especially if you knew nothing about construction before. I mean, just think about all the levers that we talked about today. You guys can apply this knowledge to your projects today. So hopefully this is helpful for everybody. And if you guys have any questions that you would want me to follow up with Patrick, Patrick, I can't wait to kind of bring you back on another podcast and we can get into the weeds of our project because that will make things super tangible for so many of our audience members. But Patrick, thank you so much for coming on again, man. I appreciate you so much, brother.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right. And we are out.